Hi guys, welcome to another edition for the Global Economy F585 paper. So what I'd like to do today is to just take a look at extract 5 and to consider the various arguments which you might like to include or might anticipate including in an essay question. It's clear from the extract material that you've been provided with that you will have to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of globalization in some way, shape, form or fashion. That is bound to comprise some part of your answer. So what I'd like to do today is to just look at the orthodox view of globalization and then to consider some counter arguments which you could include in an answer to an essay. So without further ado, let's get started. So what you can see I've done here is I've just created a table here, orthodox view on the left, radical view on the right, which is the counter argument really. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about each one of these and then you can assess how you might wish to incorporate these into an essay answer. So first of all, globalization helps to fill the knowledge gap. Obviously there's knowledge in the form of human capital investment, but there's also the knowledge in terms of technology transfer and so on. It's interesting, if you read Stiglitz's book, he talks about knowledge as being a public good, and so globalization helps to fill that gap in knowledge. Now, the counter argument to that would be, I guess, that it's all very well providing these developing nations with the knowledge, but they need to be able to put that knowledge to some use. Primarily, of course, in the employment industry and getting a job and being able to contribute to the economy. But in many of these developing nations that we're pointed to in the extract material, these opportunities for employment simply do not exist. And so that would be the obvious counter argument to the very traditional orthodox view. Next one. There's a very traditional theory, and if I just scroll down slightly here, we should be able to get this in shot. So we've got the notion here of the Harrod-Domar model. If you're not aware of what that is, you can find it in the A2 textbook. But the basic premise of this model is that savings leads to growth, which leads to investment. And if developing nations can save a little bit more, there'll be more money in their banks. The banks, of course, their primary aim, the private sector banks, is to make a profit. And how do they make profits? They make profits by issuing loans. And they have what is known as a cash deposit ratio. So, as identified in this example, if the cash deposit ratio is 10% and the banks receive a new deposit of £100, the bank will keep £10 and they can lend £90. That £90 can be used by a firm for investment purposes, which will help to grow the economy. That's the Harrod-Domar growth model. How would we counter that? Well, who lives in these developing nations? Well, if you read Stiglitz's book, Making Globalization Work, about 80% of the world's population are actually living in developing nations. And they, of course, it's just not reasonable. They do not earn enough money. They do not earn sufficient income to enable them to save, which would subsequently enable the banks to lend and so on and so forth. And so this notion of the savings gap in that respect persists. If the countries cannot save, they then obviously become reliant on aid to fund investment projects. But very often that aid is tied aid, so there'll be certain stipulations that go alongside that money. It's not just, well, here's the money, do as you will with it. There are certain restrictions.
Please contact reception. Thank you.
That go alongside of that. Money is not given for nothing. We want you to reciprocate in some way. If you're not sure, if you've never heard of the term tied aid, if you do a little bit of research, you'll be able to find the definition of it. Right, next little point here. Now this is not really a counter argument, but Stiglitz does mention this in his book Making Globalization Work. He does talk about the savings gap, and the savings gap can be filled by migrants who work abroad and then send a significant proportion of their earnings home. So obviously very topical at the moment, coming up to the election, the whole issue of immigration and so on and so forth. Migrants coming into the UK, they make such a tremendous contribution to the UK economy, and as part of that contribution they earn a salary, and a lot of that salary is sent back home. Now that money which is sent back home can be used to help to plug the lack of savings which is intrinsic in the developing nation. And then there's a few other points we could make here as follows. So developing, again, comes from Stiglitz' textbook, his book Making Globalization Work. Developing nations do not want to save abroad, because of course if they did, they would be exchanging their currency for a foreign currency. They would be getting rid of their currency, selling it, and buying the foreign currency. You ought to know from your knowledge of exchange rates and the way exchange rate markets work, when a currency is sold, the value of that currency will depreciate. Now this has a number of detrimental impacts. First of all, when the exchange rate depreciates, as you know, the price of an export always goes in the same direction as a currency movement. So if you haven't heard that term before, it's very well worth learning and remembering. The price of the currency, sorry, I'll say that again, the price of the export always moves in the same direction as the currency. So as the currency falls, the price of the export falls. Now you might say to yourself, well, that's great because it makes them more competitive. True. However, that has a very detrimental impact on the terms of trade. Terms of trade being the ratio of export prices to import prices. Again, if you're not familiar with that term and what it means, I suggest you would look that one up. But basically it's telling you how many units of an export you need to sell to buy one import. This is a very important concept, very important for developing nations, because in order to import new machinery, new technology, they need the money from their export sales. Well, if their terms of trade keep declining, they have to sell more and more units of exports to buy in one unit of import. That's the first problem. Second problem is the impact on their debt to GDP ratio. If a country is selling its currency and it's quite heavily indebted, albeit in its own currency, the value of their borrowings will increase. So for example, if Zambia had quite significant borrowings in its own currency, and then the value of Zambia's currency fell, well, let's say it fell by half, that would mean that its debt to GDP ratio would actually double. Now, that is less likely to be a problem because most of these countries will be borrowing in probably US dollars, but it's worth considering. Okay, let's move back to the orthodox view again and see. Let's see what we have next. Just scroll up here. So what does globalization do? Globalization creates jobs, increases standards of living, etc. These are the sort of standard textbook definitions. I'll have to put my teeth in today. There's a great quote in Stiglitz' book referring to Thomas Jefferson, third US president, and he describes globalization as being like a candle. As it lights another candle, the light of the original candle is not diminished. What a great quotation to put in an essay. And globalization again also results in technology transfer, closing the knowledge and resource gap, bringing goods to market, creating jobs, and obviously stimulating growth. So what's the radical view on that? What do the radicals say is bad about that? Well, they would say that although these jobs are created, very often they're created in the urban centres, and as everyone migrates to these centres, that brings with it great squalor, great noise, great pollution, poor sanitation. So the environmental impact of globalisation. And I've included another, what I think is a great definition here, a great quotation. Carbon dioxide molecules do not respect borders. Isn't that tremendous? Globalization has encouraged a race to the bottom as well. So what we mean by the race to the bottom is that companies do not want to pay very exorbitant and extortionate fees for regulations. They don't have to meet very strict regulations. So they look for countries which have the weakest regulations and laws, and then that is the place they choose to locate. It's really exploitation, and again that would be the radical counter-argument to the orthodoxy. Okay. Next orthodox consideration. Globalization reduces trade barriers. Now, as markets open up, as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, encourages world trade, it is true that all countries in the world, developing and developed, are encouraged to reduce trade barriers. And you will know from your studies of macroeconomics that specialization and free trade should, theoretically, increase and improve standards of living. The radical view is that trade liberalization has, however, been asymmetric. In other words, very one-sided. Whilst the developing economies have been very quick to pull the trade barriers down, the developed world have been very slow to reciprocate. And why have they been slow to reciprocate? Because they deem it as a threat. The fact that these developing nations can offer low wages, and therefore they are frightened by the fact that big companies which employ big numbers of people in the developed world will move overseas. Next orthodox consideration is that globalization creates more opportunities for trade. So this sort of follows on from the previous one. Large multinational companies locate in the developing world, as previously explained. What's another radical view on that? Well, developing nations, they may have the manufacturers located in their countries, but they are often unable to take advantage of the opportunities which arise because they do not have the infrastructure. They do not have the skills or the capital equipment necessary to meet the high requirements for the standard of goods to be shipped to the developed world. And of course, they also feel under pressure, they feel threatened, they feel frightened, because the multinational companies will threaten to move elsewhere and could take with them, of course, their tax revenue, all of the jobs, and all of the foreign investment. So they are under pressure. They do feel vulnerable, I guess, in that respect. Okay, next orthodox view, again relating to the trade barriers. And just a point on this, it would be, now this, I guess, it's less sort of radical, but we're saying that governments in the developed world have all sorts of sources of revenues. But in the developing world, where they really are struggling for sources of revenues, one guaranteed place to get it is from a tariff. And so if under the process of globalization they are encouraged and indeed maybe forced, coerced to reduce and remove trade barriers such as tariffs, they then lose those almost guaranteed revenue streams, which is obviously difficult for them to recoup and replace. And then finally, globalization should benefit resource-rich countries and should give them access to global financial and capital markets. We talked about Harrod Domar, savings leading to investment, leading to growth. Well, you also need to be able to borrow, and you need access to the financial markets and the capital markets to be able to do that. The radical view, of course, is that not everybody in developing nations will benefit, because as the countries get wealthy, the ruling classes, which is often only a handful of people in some instances, they then have the power, the financial clout to maintain that wealth, and that of course breeds discontent. You only need to look at countries such as Zimbabwe to see great examples of that, Nigeria and so on. Nigeria, very oil rich, yet most of the people, indeed the numbers of people living in relative poverty in Nigeria has gone up and up and up. And a final great point here with regard to a sort of a micro theory. You'll have heard of the moral hazard problem, whereby economic agents, generally speaking consumers and individuals, don't really behave in a rational sense. So for example, this occurs quite often with young people, young teenagers, in the car insurance market and so on. If you have car insurance, you tend to behave a little bit more recklessly than if you didn't, because you know if you crash the car, if you write the car off, the insurance company picks up the bill. If you didn't have insurance, you would have to pick up the bill, so you'd be forced to drive a bit more carefully. It'd be in your own interests. Similarly, this is one of the problems of, and I'm not saying this is a point for your essay, I'm just outlining the point here, but developing nations which borrow very, very heavily and then ask for their debts to be wiped out, well, if you simply wipe their debts out, they then have no incentive to alter their behaviour, and then they have an incentive actually to just behave recklessly once again. And we can apply this in the same way to this essay question, whereby the Western banks, they know that should the developing nation be unable to repay any debts that they owe to the developed world, well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has in the past just stepped in, bailed the countries out, and the banks get their money back. And so there is an incentive there for banks to behave a little bit recklessly, a little bit unfairly, unjustly, and to lend these developing nations much more money than they really should be lent. If the banks were behaving in a responsible fashion, they would say, well, you could pay this much back, but you couldn't pay that much back. They deliberately lend them too much money, making much more profit, and they know that they are quids in either way, because either the developing nation pays them back or the IMF bailout pays them back. So that's a few thoughts on Extract 5, and I'll be back with a few more thoughts next week probably. Hope the revision's going well, and I've had a few requests for a few different videos which I'll try and put up in the next week or two. So if you've got any particular questions, or if you'd like me to go through anything in particular, just let me know and I'll try and get something put together. Bye for now.